Long after the Second World War ended, the German soldiers who had fought their way across the desert and half of Europe could talk about almost all of it. They could describe the tanks, the artillery that never stopped, the cold, the mud, the hunger, the friends who never came home. Over the years they made a kind of peace with the machinery of the war, but many of them could never talk calmly about one thing, one sound, and when it came up, the old men would go quiet. They would change the subject or lower their voices, the way people do when they talk about something they still don't fully understand. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an explosion. It was music. A strange, droning, wailing music that came drifting across the dark before an attack while it was still too early to see. The sound of the Scottish Highlanders, the sound of the pipes. The men who heard it, dug in, waiting, rifles ready, remembered it for the rest of their lives. Not the shells that nearly killed them, the music. So what was it about that sound that stayed with them longer than the men who were trying to kill them? There was a name the German army had for the Scottish soldiers. It didn't start in this war. It came from their fathers. Die Damen aus der Hölle, the ladies from hell. The ladies part was the kilts. To a German soldier, a man walking into battle in what looked like a skirt was a strange, almost unsettling sight. But the from hell part, that was earned in the trenches of the First World War, where the Highland regiments built a reputation German troops carried home and passed down to their sons. To understand that name, you have to picture the war their fathers fought. In 1915, at the Battle of Loos, a piper named Daniel Laidlaw climbed out of the trench under heavy fire and walked along the parapet, playing, while shells fell around him and men followed him into the smoke. He was wounded. He survived, and they gave him the Victoria Cross. Stories like that one didn't just live in Scotland. They crossed no man's land. The German troops who faced those pipers went home and told their families about the men in skirts who came on behind music and would not break. So by the time the Second War came, most German soldiers had never met a Scotsman. But they'd heard of them, the men in skirts who didn't stop, and the sound that came before them. The fear was already there, waiting, inherited. The Highlanders just had to remind them of it. Let's be honest about how strange this was. By 1940, war was industrial. It was tanks and radios and artillery aimed by mathematics. And into the middle of that, the Scottish regiment still sent a man in a kilt, carrying no weapon, playing an instrument that could be heard a mile away, including by the enemy. On paper, it's madness. A piper can't shoot back. He walks upright while everyone else takes cover. He announces exactly where he is. He should be the first man to die. And yet, the Germans came to dread him. Not because of what he could do to them, because of what the sound did to the men behind him, and to their own nerves in the dark. German veterans described it again and again, and they nearly always reached for the same details. It wasn't the volume. It was that the pipes seemed to come from everywhere at once. That low, unbroken drone underneath the melody carried in a way no other battlefield sound did. Gunfire told you where the enemy was. The pipes didn't. They filled the whole valley. They bounced off the hills. A frightened man couldn't point his rifle at music. And there was something worse. Something they admitted almost reluctantly. The pipes never sounded afraid. You could hear panic in a shouting officer. You could hear desperation in a screaming charge. But the pipe tune came steady, patient. The same melody whether men were falling or advancing, and to a 19-year-old in a foxhole, that steadiness was its own kind of terror. It told him the men coming toward him weren't nervous, that to them this was normal, that they had already decided how this was going to end. One account put it in a single word that stuck. He said the pipes didn't sound like an attack. They sounded like a verdict. To understand why grown men, hardened, experienced soldiers, feared a musician with no gun, you have to see the moment that sound and the men behind it met the German army in the open. And for that, we go to the desert. October 1942, Egypt. The second battle of El Alamein. This was the hinge of the whole war in North Africa. Rommel's army on one side, the British Eighth Army on the other. And between them, a flat stretch of moonlit sand with almost nowhere to hide. Rommel had spent weeks turning that ground into a killing field. 500,000 mines, barbed wire, machine gun nests sighted to cover every yard. His men had a name for it. They called it the Devil's Gardens. To cross it, you had to walk slowly through narrow cleared lanes, in the open, in the dark, while the enemy waited for you. And when the great attack opened, the 51st Highland Division was sent forward across exactly that ground, straight at the German and Italian lines. Picture it from the other side. You're dug in behind the wire and the minefields. It's night. The British guns have been hammering you for hours, a bombardment so enormous the horizon looks like it's on fire. Then, suddenly, the guns lift. And in the ringing silence across that dead flat ground, you hear it. Pipers, walking, playing. The Highlanders advanced behind their pipers that night. Some played their own company's tune on purpose, so that in the smoke and chaos, a man could find his unit by ear. Follow the sound of your piper, and you were following your own men. In ground where taking a wrong step meant a mine and losing your unit meant dying alone, that music was a lifeline. It was navigation. It was courage. And for the pipers themselves, it was close to suicide. The German gunners understood exactly what that music was doing. Kill the piper, and you might break the attack. So they aimed for them. And piper after piper went down. But here's the detail that turns up in German accounts, the one that changed the fear into something else. When a piper fell, the music didn't always stop. Sometimes he kept playing on the ground after he'd been hit until the tune finally died with him. And sometimes another piper further down the line would simply pick up the melody, and the sound would carry on, move sideways, refuse to end. German soldiers who survived El Alamein said that was the moment disbelief crept in. What kind of army sends musicians first? You could kill the piper, and the music didn't stop. You could kill the man behind him, and they still came on. Calm, unhurried, certain. There's a phrase that appears over and over in enemy memories of the Highlanders, and it's worth sitting with. They said the Scots fought like men who had already accepted they weren't coming back, and were completely at peace with it. That is a terrifying enemy, not an angry one, a calm one. And El Alamein was not a single strange night. The following year, when the Allies landed in Sicily and began clawing their way up through the Mediterranean, the Highland regiments were there again, and the pipes went with them. The enemy learned that this wasn't a stunt or a one-off. It was who these men were. Wherever the Scots went, the sound went ahead of them. But those pipers walking into the guns were doing something else remarkable that almost nobody knows. By the time they did it, they were breaking the rules to be there at all. Officially, what they were doing had been banned. After the First World War, the British Army did the arithmetic, and the arithmetic was grim. The losses among pipers in the trenches had been catastrophic. These were skilled men. It takes years to make a good piper. And they were dying in enormous numbers precisely because they led from the front, upright and exposed. Men like Daniel Laidlaw were the lucky ones. Most who did what he did never came back. So the order came down. Pipers were no longer to play their men into battle on the front line. It cost too many of the regiment's best for a few minutes of music. On paper, that was the end of piping into battle. In reality, the Scots kept doing it. Quietly, sometimes in open defiance. Because the men in the Highland regiments understood something the planners in London did not. The pipes weren't decoration. They were the reason ordinary, frightened young men could do what was being asked of them at all. A tune from home, in the worst moment of your life, could carry you forward when nothing else could. And there's a moment from D-Day that captures that defiance perfectly. It also brings us to the most famous piper of the entire war. His name was Bill Millin, and he was the personal piper to Lord Lovat, the commander of a brigade of British commandos. When Lovat asked him to play the men ashore, Millin pointed out that regulations forbade it, and Lovat, a Highlander himself, brushed it aside. That order, he said, came from the English War Office. He and Millin were both Scottish, so it didn't apply to them. With that, a man walked onto one of the deadliest beaches in history carrying nothing but a set of bagpipes. June the 6th, 1944. Sword Beach, Normandy, Among the first men ashore was Lovett's commando brigade, and walking among them, in a kilt, with no helmet, no rifle, was Bill Millin. Read that again. No helmet, no rifle, a kilt. On D-Day. As the ramp went down and the men waded into fire, Millin struck up a tune called Highland Laddie. Then, while thousands of men crouched and sprinted through machine gun fire, while the water turned red and the sand was torn apart by mortars, he did something almost impossible to believe. He walked up and down the beach in full view and played. His commander had asked him to, so he did. He piped as men fell around him. He marched along the waterline playing The Road to the Isles, back and forth, as if the whole roaring nightmare of Sword Beach were just another parade ground. And the Germans, dug into the high ground with clear lines of fire, didn't shoot him. He was, by any measure, the easiest target on the beach. Upright, slow, unarmed, in a kilt, and they let him live. It didn't end at the beach, either. That same day, the commandos had to cross a narrow bridge inland, later known as Pegasus Bridge, and it was covered by German snipers. Men who stepped onto it were being hit, and Bill Millin walked out onto that exposed bridge and piped the commandos across it in the open while the bullets came. Some of the men crossing were shot. He kept playing. He reached the other side. After the war, Millin found out why he had lived. Captured German soldiers were asked about the madman on the beach, the one in the skirt walking through the killing zone playing music while everyone else clung to the sand. Why didn't you shoot him? Their answer became legend. They said they didn't shoot him because they thought he had lost his mind. And you don't waste a bullet on a madman. Sit with what that tells us. The single bravest thing on that beach, walking through hell unarmed to give your friends courage, was so far beyond what the enemy could understand that they filed it under insanity. The Germans had a category for a soldier who fights. They had one for a soldier who runs. They had no category at all for a man who strolls through a massacre playing a tune to steady the men dying beside him. That was the Highland difference in one image. And Bill Millin lived. He came home, he kept his pipes, and today a statue stands in Normandy to the piper the Germans wouldn't shoot, because they couldn't believe he was real. But we still haven't answered the deepest question. Why did it work? Why did a sound rattle men who had faced tanks and flamethrowers without breaking? What did the Germans actually hear when the pipes started before dawn? The answer isn't what you'd expect. When German veterans wrote about the bagpipes as old men, safe at home, with nothing left to prove, they didn't describe the fear the way you'd think. They didn't say it was loud or ugly. Most of them reached for a stranger word. They said it sounded like grief. That's the thing the enemy understood, maybe better than the Scots themselves. The bagpipe isn't a triumphant instrument. It doesn't blare victory like a trumpet. It sounds like mourning, like a funeral and a battle cry carried in the same breath. And when it drifted across no man's land before an attack, it carried a message every soldier understood without translation. We are already grieving for our dead, and we are coming anyway. That's what got under their skin. Ordinary fear you can manage. You can tell yourself the enemy is just as scared as you are, that he wants to live as badly as you do, that he'll break if you hold the line. The pipes took that comfort away. They announced men who had already grieved themselves, men who had made their peace, men now walking toward you with terrible, unhurried certainty. And there it is. A screaming charge tells the enemy you're desperate. A slow, steady advance behind a mourning pipe tune tells him you're inevitable. The first, he can fight. The second, he can only survive, if he's lucky. There was a strange kind of respect buried in that dread, too. The Germans weren't laughing at the men in kilts, not after the first time. They had learned, the hard way, that the joke had teeth. The nickname their fathers coined as an insult had turned into something closer to a warning. Because in the end, the Germans were never really afraid of the noise. They were afraid of the men who could stay that calm inside it. The pipes were just the sound their calm made. This channel doesn't do fairy tales, so let's be honest about the cost. The pipers who did this weren't supermen. They were farm boys and shepherds' sons and factory workers from the Highlands and the islands, places where the pipes were the sound of weddings and funerals and Sunday mornings, the sound of home. They learned to play as children. Then the war took that gentle, homesick skill and asked them to walk unarmed into machine guns with it, so the men beside them could find the courage to follow. Many never came home. The very thing that made them so effective, walking upright, playing, refusing to hide, made them the easiest men on the field to kill, and the enemy aimed for them on purpose. Every time a piper stepped off into the dark, he was making a bargain most of us can barely imagine, his life, spent slowly and in full view, so his friends could keep moving forward. And the Highland regiments themselves paid a fearful price across the whole war, in the desert, in Sicily, in Normandy, in the long grind into Germany, the Black Watch, the Seaforths, the Gordons, the Camerons, the Argylls. These names cost a generation of Scottish villages their sons. Go to the Highlands today, and you'll still find war memorials in tiny hamlets with more names cut into the stone than the village looks large enough to have ever held. Whole streets of boys who grew up together, learned the same tunes, and went off to the same war. Some of those names are the pipers, some are the men who followed the pipers. In those villages, they were never really separate. That's the truth the sound was hiding. Behind that fearsome, unbreakable music was a column of frightened young men doing the bravest thing frightened young men can do, walking forward anyway together, because someone up ahead was playing the tune of home. The Germans feared the pipes, but if they'd truly understood what they were hearing, they might have feared something simpler, not the music, what the music was made of. These men were walking toward death for each other, and the pipes were just that turned up loud enough for an enemy to hear across a mile of dark ground. By the end of the war, piping men into battle largely came to an end. Warfare kept changing, and the old way, a charge behind a lone musician, couldn't survive the modern battlefield forever. The pipes moved to where you hear them now, at parades, at memorials, at the gravesides of the men they once led into fire, but the memory outlived the practice. And some of the strongest proof of what those pipers did comes not from Scotland at all, but from Germany, from the men on the receiving end. Old German veterans, decades later, would go quiet when the Highlanders came up. And more than one said a version of the same thing. Of everything they faced in the war, the bombers, the tanks, the endless shelling, the sound they never forgot, the one that came back to them in their sleep as old men, was the pipes in the dark before the attack. They remembered the enemy's music more clearly than their own victories. That's the highest respect a soldier can pay an enemy. The Germans didn't remember the Highlanders as men they'd beaten, or simply feared. They remembered them as men they couldn't explain. Men who walked toward death playing a funeral song and somehow made it sound like courage. So the next time you hear the pipes, at a memorial, in a film, drifting across a cold morning somewhere, listen for the drone underneath the melody, that low, steady note that never wavers, no matter what the tune does on top of it. That's the note the Germans heard first in the dark, before the light, the one that told them it was already too late. And that's the sound a generation of young Scotsmen chose to become, so the men beside them would never have to walk into the dawn alone. They carried no rifles. They carried everyone behind them, lest we forget.